welcome back to another Deep podcast. I'm D,
And I'm Cast.
and today we're going to be talking about food manners. Are they useful? Is there actually a purpose behind them? What's the use of them? So, I'll start it off with a specific question. Is there anything wrong with belching while you eat? Not just burping, but like projecting it out and belching.
It is entirely a cultural thing in some places, such as I believe Italy. If you belch during or after a meal, it shows that you very much gorged yourself, and which implies that it was quite good, and you are showing to the host that you really enjoyed it.
Right, that you're more likely to belch if you're eating quickly because you're going to get air mixed in with the food. And if you ate quickly, it means probably that you really liked the food. So
Mhm.
belching says that was a really satisfying meal and it's complimentary. And it's not just Italy, I've heard it in other cultures, but
Yeah.
in I think much more high society of like Western culture, belching while you eat is deemed inappropriate because it's loud and obnoxious, and particularly
Yeah.
when you're having a lot of conversations, it can kind of interrupt those conversations. So
Yeah.
from that
And
perspective,
yeah.
you're interfering with normal mode of interaction during eating.
Right. And I don't know if this how much this plays into the original, not being okay with belching, but the fact that things can be thrown forth from your mouth while you're belching, um, you know,
Yeah,
some might find
absolutely.
gross.
Particularly if you're really projecting it out, particles can be coming out of your mouth and onto other people's food. And I think that that's much more likely to happen with coughing. That
Mhm.
culturally, or in most cultures, it's polite to cover your mouth while you cough, and particularly while you're eating, you shouldn't be coughing at other people. And it's a pretty simple reason for that is you can see particles of food coming out of their mouth and going into your mouth. That may not be problematic under a lot of circumstances, but particularly with historically the spread of disease hasn't been entirely clear. Germ theory is relatively recent, so how does disease spread?
Yeah.
2,000 years ago, we didn't have a good grasp on it, but if you notice that someone is sick, they start coughing, and then other people that ate with them started to get sick.
Hmm.
It's a pretty easy way of saying, well, hey, maybe the person that's coughing should make sure that they eat separately,
Hmm.
or they cover their mouth to make sure that food doesn't go all over the place.
Right.
It's much less likely to happen while you're belching. So I think that belching is more of a just societal norm that, hey, this is just something that we do or don't do, and it's not necessarily going to be tied to a specific health concern. Not
Right.
nearly as much as something like washing your hands.
Right. And I mean, that is a very good lead into another point that I wanted to talk about is like washing your hands is, pretty recent, the last 100 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
um, because of germ theory.
Mm-hmm.
But with like thinking about cultures that used a lot of cutlery, you had a barrier between your hand, possibly full of who knows what, because you've been doing all sorts of different things throughout the day,
Mm-hmm.
and the food which you're then ingesting. There's a possibility there that the reason certain cutlery you know, were, became common, even if they didn't realize it, was because it potentially led to less sickness.
Possibly,
Because
even if it wasn't
yeah.
an intentional change, if d- if you were eating with your hands all the time, you were much more likely to get disease from, particularly if you're cutting up the animal, you don't wash your hands, and then you cook the food, but then still eat with your hands. You're more
Mhm.
likely to get any disease that the animal was carrying compared to if you cut up the animal, cooked it, and then used utensils for it. You're much less likely to catch any disease. So it would just be a survival of the fittest, not survival of the fittest, but
Mhm.
natural selection in place that when people started to use cutlery or tools for eating, they were less likely to get sick
Yeah.
from it and more likely to survive, which means the people who had the tradition of using cutlery and using tools were more likely to pass that on to their children. So I think that
Right.
utensils was likely a,
I mean,
while it's not
yeah.
obvious, I think it's from natural selection.
Yeah. Well, so the utensils, for the most part, have only been around since the 18th century. It wasn't until the 18th century that utensils came into play, and really the idea of table manners started to take hold in, the high levels of society, kings and queens, and
Hmm.
everyone up there, where they started treating a mealtime. Well, so I was going to say treating a mealtime more like a social experience, but I think that to an extent has always been the case. But treating it more as a formal social experience and not as a just purely social experience.
Sure. So let's come back to the high society in a little bit, but let's just talk about the social experience.
Right.
Historically, eating has been a sit down and have a meal rather than nibble on things throughout the day.
Right.
At least
Well, so
in most
yeah.
of modern history, as
Right.
in the past couple
Right.
thousand years, to my understanding, it's been sit down and eat all at once,
Mhm.
as opposed to when we were hunter gatherers. Hunting, you may have a feast on the animal, which would be a sit down meal, I guess you could say. But if you're gathering, you can eat while you gather. Gather extra in a basket, bring it back, and then share that with everyone else that have been doing other work. But you
Mhm.
yourself may have eaten along the way. But I guess part of the benefit of all eating together and not eating separately is if you're trying to find a way to divvy up food evenly and make sure that
Mhm.
no one is getting a larger share than everyone else, the way that you
Right.
determine that is make sure that whenever you're eating, other people are around to
Mhm.
ensure that you can't just sneak food, or if you are
Right.
sneaking food outside of the meal, it means that you're probably not either stealing food or not sharing food. So it's
Yeah.
a way of ensuring
Yep.
equity of
And
food.
yeah, in early tribe-like settings, and potentially even like before humans as they are now existed, that probably played a lot into it, where eating as a group ensured that everyone got a fair share. In
Hmm.
certain cases, if you're in like a wolf pack, there's going to be the alpha, and the alpha always gets
The
their
alpha
share,
eats
and
first,
then right, and
and
that's
that's
I mean that may very well very similar things that led to that mentality in wolf packs may have led into the mentality in human nature, where
hmm
often the person that brings home the bacon, I will say, or
hmm
provides for the family, is the person that is gets the largest share, or
A-
the,
absolutely. And the way that you do that is by eating all at once so that you can
mhm,
see who gets what. And
right,
particularly with the wolf pack example, the alpha eating first, if they are the leader and they need the most nutrients to be able to defend the pack, they need to
mhm,
have the lion's share, to bring another animal into it, to make sure that they can continue to lead and be effective at defending the pack. So I think besides that though, not just the making sure that no one is cheating with their food, uh, or cheating on how much food they're getting. It's also just the social experience that as you're eating together, it's an excuse to come sit down with each other and potentially have discussions and catch up on what's been going on. If you're
mhm,
spending a majority of the day apart from each other, coming back and catching up on what's been happening in the day, you may get news of, well, what happened while you were out gathering? What animals did you see? Again, we're
right.
pretty far detached in terms of in modern times we aren't going out and hunting for our food
Mhm.
in most cases, but historically that's probably
There's
where it
still
developed.
some level of being provided for by someone, or some, like a certain people in a social eating situation.
Mhm.
So thinking about a family, maybe two parents and several children, the parents are like the social, they're I guess socially higher in at the dinner table, where they kind of have control over the situation. They choose how much they eat, but they also choose how much the children eat.
Mhm.
It's they have that option, and can kind of, I would almost say, like put habits into their children that will help them as an adult when they become that new role of caring for their own children in the future.
Mhm.
Um,
And I think some of that is accurate in terms of a parent saying, you're going to eat because you need to eat, and you're a kid, your mind is kind of scatterbrained. You may not want to eat right now, but you're going to because we're not going to have food later. This is when it's
right.
prepared. You need to eat. On the flip side, something that I'm betting a lot of people may have been annoyed with is traditions like don't eat with your elbows on the table.
Right.
So I think that's probably going to be an example that what possible basis could the rule have come from of keep your elbows off the table while you eat? Do you think that that's a valid rule to have, and why?
I don't think so. I mean, it's not something that I personally practice, but I don't think it's a generally valid rule.
Mm-hmm.
My thoughts are, potentially if you have your hands above the table but your elbows are not, you are less you're in less of an aggressive stance than with the elbows on the table, especially if you have a sharp
Mm-hmm.
knife in your hand.
Mm-hmm.
And then you also are almost being a subordinate in that you have to do a much larger action to be able to grab additional food if it's, let's say, in the middle of the table.
Mm-hmm.
You 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 basically you can't very quickly grab something, grab it, and eat it before people can react. So that may have played into it. As far as today's day and age, I think it is just a holdover from times where maybe it was more it had more of a necessity.
Right, and I think that there's probably an origin for it. And I can imagine circumstances where it would be a valid point to make. For instance, if let's say 1,000 years ago, and you're eating food, you have a table and you have a communal eating area, and you're leaning against the thing that's supporting the food. If you worked very hard to find that food and prepare the food, leaning on the platform that is supporting the food means you're risking dumping that food onto the ground, and particularly when food is very, very scarce, like in the winter, that you could end up putting yourself at risk for starvation if you knock the table over. So being
Right.
careful while you eat, I think, is something that
Mhm.
used to be taken much more into consideration compared to nowadays, where we throw a lot of food out because, well, I'm full. I don't really need to eat more. I'm just going to toss this food.
Yeah, it's too much
Without
work to preserve it for later too.
exactly. And even if you look as recently back as 100 years ago, uh, food preservation was much more important
Yeah.
because they didn't have things like refrigeration. And a
Yep.
lot of countries nowadays still don't have refrigeration for food preservation. So preserving the food that you have is, or can be, literally a difference between life and death. And
Hmm.
so even something as simple as putting your elbows on the table for places where food preservation is actually important and food is a scarce resource, uh, that's also, you're probably also in the situation where a nice table is probably
I
also a
mean,
scarce resource, and having it tip over and fall onto the ground and be mixed up with dirt is not going to be a good experience.
now you are making a bit of an assumption here that is, I think plays into food manners in general, eating at a table. I mean,
Sure.
there are many cultures that will sit around and like eat from a shared pool of resources at the middle of the floor, or maybe a very short table
Hmm.
where they are sitting on the floor. um
Or I believe, is it old Russian, potentially old Japanese styles of eating, where you have more of a pillow on the ground that you sit or lay down on, and then use one of your hands to actually bring food to your mouth. So you're more laying down as opposed to sitting.
mhm. I mean, thinking about like old Roman paintings of hedonism and whatnot, it's
Hmm.
you are laying on your back and food is being brought to your mouth because
Hmm.
you are far too good for the world to have to move to get your
Well,
food.
I think that that's a matter of, it's a sign of seniority, kind of like being the alpha of the pack. In terms of hedonism, you are so wealthy that you can actually pay other people to bring food to your mouth because you can't even be bothered for that. You're just focusing on other things. Now, granted, those focusing on those other things probably aren't going to be as productive as much as they are reproductive, but nonetheless, it's a sign of superiority, and you can demonstrate to others how superior you are by how much you're able to get other people to do for you. And bringing food to your mouth, I think, is a good example that most people do it for themselves because everyone needs to do it. The obvious person to do that is yourself. But if you can pay other people to baby you, I can imagine that also being a sign of disrespect, where if you are not as capable as other people, so for instance, people with Parkinson's disease, sometimes people have to feed them, and it's more of an embarrassment. So from a hedonism perspective, ah, yes, you're bringing food to my mouth. It's a good thing. But from a decrepit person, I don't think that decrepit is going to be the right word, but a disabled person, food being brought to your mouth is an embarrassment because it means that you can't do something even as simple
Yeah.
as just bringing food to your mouth.
There's a difference between being unable to feed yourself
Mm-hmm.
and being able to like unable to physically feed yourself
Mm-hmm.
and paying someone else to do it because you are, so too good for it.
Because you're
Um,
lazy. Yeah, the reason behind why someone else is bringing food to your mouth is going to change the notion on it. So, for instance, if you're a baby, you are being your mouth is being brought up to the food as you're sucking on the nipple, and that's because you have no idea how to do anything besides literally just suck on a nipple. And speaking of feeding a baby, what are your thoughts on breastfeeding while like during a meal? So if a mother is eating, is there something wrong with her also breastfeeding at the same time? Because I've seen people complain of like a woman breastfeeding in a restaurant. It's like, oh, how dare you do that?
I mean, arguably, you are every time someone's breastfeeding, it's during a meal, um,
Yeah, yes.
somebody's meal.
Technically speaking, it's during somebody's meal, but yeah,
Yeah,
in the communal meal, if other people are
yeah.
eating and the woman is
I
breastfeeding the baby, is there something wrong with that?
personally, I don't think so. I think that breastfeeding is a completely normal part and a normal aspect to raising a new human. I mean, not everyone can breastfeed, so I'm not saying
Mm-hmm.
if you are having a baby, you must breastfeed, but I'm saying that it is a very natural part to having a child, and it should be looked at as that and not as a sexualized phenomenon that it's like, oh no, she's got her boobs out feeding her baby. How dare she feed her baby?
Right.
That's just not that's not right.
Absolutely. And I, you're right. It is one of the most natural processes is to be able to feed babies, and literally we would not be here as a species if breastfeeding wasn't a thing.
Right.
So having the
And
baby eat at the same time, and granted, a baby is not going to be beholden to the same 3 meals a day schedule as most other people because
mhm,
it's a baby. It eats when it wants, and you
right.
don't really have much control over that.
Hmm.
But
Yeah. And that's part of it too. It's like if you're in a restaurant and you have your baby there and your baby needs to be fed, what are you supposed to do? Like
well,
just leave?
and let's say you do bring your baby to a restaurant and it starts to cry.
Mhm.
Something that I think is challenging with children, particularly young children, is the child is always right.
I mean, the
The
child can't be wrong, really.
yes,
I'm gonna say it
you
that way.
you can't just respond to a child like, oh, you were trying to crawl over and you bumped your head against a table. Yeah, well, too bad. But buck up and take it like a man. You can't do that. So
Yeah.
the child
Yeah.
can never be wrong in that regard. And if it's
At
hungry,
that age,
it
I will say.
right. The, yes, at the age before they can communicate and before they really start to understand what the world is and how to interact with it, all they
Right.
really know how to do is eat, sleep, and poop
Right.
and cry when one of those things is out of whack. So if they're crying, it's probably because they're hungry and they don't know what to do and they
Mhm.
need you to tell them what to do, which is give them a nipple so that they can feed.
Right.
And if you're in the middle of a restaurant with a baby and it's crying, if a way to make them stop crying is to feed them, it would be better than letting the baby cry. Now that
Oh
also
yeah.
depends, or that is dependent on the fact that you've brought a baby into a restaurant, which is
Hmm.
why I think that not bringing a baby to a restaurant is a sign of politeness. That hey, this is supposed to be a relatively
Oh
quiet
yeah.
place where people can converse, and bringing a baby risks interfering
Yeah.
with that balance.
I would
So,
I would say, yeah, it is a it there I mean, of course, is a risk that you are going to, take away from others. Like if you're in a restaurant and your baby starts crying, you made a decision to bring your baby there. I'm not and but, people that have children probably might, it's not like they don't deserve to go out to eat once in a while, and it's not
mhm,
like they always find a place, that I mean, there's the thoughts of I mean, along the lines of having a backup plan, like knowing if your
mhm,
baby starts crying, knowing where you can go, knowing,
mhm.
how to
Having
soothe
a
it,
mother's room,
right. Like going outside for a second and just like settling baby down, maybe getting the breastfeeding started and then heading back in or
but
whatever it is, or
but
like going
but
changing the diaper or
I would say
try.
making a mother go outside to feed her baby as a social
Mhm.
norm is
Not go outside,
well,
but go
but
outside
I know
to
what you mean,
stop
like
the
leaving
crying.
to a different position to be able to feed the baby. I
It's
that,
not what I'm saying. I am saying to stop the crying,
oh,
leaving,
okay,
not to feed the baby. But if a baby starts
sure,
crying and you have to, triage why is the baby crying? Does it
yep,
have a full diaper? No. Is it because it's uncomfortable? No. Is
hmm,
it too warm? Is it too cold? Oh,
sure,
it's just hungry. That can take many minutes,
hmm,
and that's many minutes of crying that
sure,
is, potentially disturbing other people's
and it's
social evenings.
and
If you
especially
know right
when you're
away,
paying a large amount of money for a nice social evening, that can be
right?
disruptive. And I think that
Yeah.
while there is some validity to the claim of mothers are really important because they literally help propagate the species,
They
so
literally propagate the species.
uh, well, they don't do it quite alone. There's at least some input from others in the
Well, yeah,
species, but
but without them, we couldn't propagate the species.
right. And with the exception of baby formula, which is again a relatively new development,
Hmm.
being able to breastfeed is what propagates the species.
Right.
So um, having a mother need to leave is basically saying, "Hey, you go deal with your thing. Let us deal with
Yeah.
leave the rest of us to it." Can be insulting to the mother because
Hmm.
it's like, hey, I'm literally raising a child here. You should be accommodating of me. But at the
Right.
same time, I don't think that being a mother should give you a get out of jail free
Right.
card
Right.
all the time for every circumstance. If you had a
Yeah.
baby in Congress and it's interfering with the ability of people to make laws, that's a completely different story compared to we're walking around Walmart and a baby is crying.
Right. That just like there needs to be there like I think that there are certain minimum expectations around when you're caring for a child, and if you are going to be caring for the child, you should be aware that if a baby starts crying, that it can disturb other people, and have at least some plans in place. You
Well,
can't
yeah.
always plan, and you can't always you're never not going to be able to you're never well, most people aren't going to be able to go to Walmart only when they don't have their child.
Oh,
You
yeah.
kind of have to care for the child at the same time.
Yeah.
So that is understandable, but like there is a responsibility on the point of the parent that is caring for the child, and but also there should be a certain level of acceptance by anyone that wants to see the species propagate.
Yep, and I think that there should be a balance between that. So for instance, if you're walking around an area where you have to have your child with you, you have to take care of the child, and particularly if you're in like shopping around Walmart, it's probably you're shopping at Walmart probably because you don't have inordinate amounts of money, and even if you're
Right.
not poor, it's like all right, we're
It's
trying
still
to
convenient.
it's convenient. We're trying to save some money, which means
Yeah.
I'm not going to put the kid in daycare while I go run to Walmart. That's not going
Right.
to be economically feasible, particularly because then daycares would be completely overrun. And then you're also not the one raising your child. So there should be some
Right.
accommodation there of woman is walking around with a baby, let her breastfeed in Walmart.
Mhm.
But if she's bringing it to a very private meeting where you actually need silence to talk about serious topics,
Yeah.
let the baby feed. And
I
we're getting off on a
yeah.
really deep tangent for baby
Mhm.
feeding etiquette. But again, I think let's try to bring it back into baby feeding at the dinner table. I think that it
So I
depends
would
on
say
I think it depends on how nice the place you're eating is. At
mhm.
home, do whatever you want because that's your business. If it's at some sort of restaurant, I think the nicer the restaurant and the more manners you're expected to uh, adhere to, the less likely it is that you should just have a baby be with you at all. I think that whether or not
Mhm.
that baby is feeding is completely irrelevant. It's whether or not you've brought a baby.
Yeah. So I'm gonna put it this way. If you are in like anywhere that feeding a baby with a bottle,
Hmm.
feeding a baby with formula in a bottle
Hmm.
is acceptable, breastfeeding should be acceptable.
And I would agree with that. And I,
And
I think that that is defined as where is it acceptable to bring a baby, and
yeah.
as people are having fewer and fewer children in developed society, that's becoming less of a problem. But I think that
Mhm.
historically it has been a much larger issue, or not even an issue, but a larger facet is
Yeah.
hey, they have children and they need to
I
bring them
mean,
with.
right, and like when having children literally meant not only their survival and the survival of the species,
Hmm.
but your survival,
Hmm.
because in a couple of years they would be able to help provide and
Hmm.
like be able to produce more than they are consuming.
Hmm.
That's it's a pretty, it's a pretty
It's
important thing.
important.
And so
Yeah.
if you are, like back when for infant mortality rates were so much higher,
Hmm.
and it was, you
You,
had to have
ch-
like
ch-
9 children to ensure that a couple of them actually survived.
yep.
You didn't have much choice but to have your children with you where you went.
Yep. Absolutely.
So, I mean, you brought up the point about the expectations of the establishment, if you
Hmm.
are whether or not it's acceptable to bring a baby, because if it is acceptable to bring a baby, like if the restaurant, it is that sort of place, maybe they explicitly
Hmm.
say it, or they are, they it can be easily assumed as much that it's okay to bring a baby into that restaurant, then there is a certain level of acceptance if that baby does baby things like crying.
If a baby does baby things, which babies tend to do.
Yeah.
So I like let's focus on the point that you brought up of a restaurant or an establishment having established set of rules that,
Hmm.
hey, if you want to eat here, that's fine, but here are the rules that you have to adhere to.
Right.
Um, the rules of politeness, for instance, don't be talking with your mouth full.
Hmm.
That's something that is generally frowned upon, and at the same time, one of the reasons that you sit down at a group meal is to be able to talk with each other.
Right. And so I think a lot of what we a lot of what we look at as manners, and whether manners are, a good thing or a bad thing, you to an extent, if you are eating somewhere, you should be if you are going anywhere really, you are expected to meet the laws of the land, the expectations of the land. Just as if you
Yes.
were to go to another country, you should follow their laws. Just
So,
because their laws are different than what you do at home does not mean you shouldn't follow them.
mhm,
You should respect where you are, and do as the locals do, whether that means,
when in
or
Rome,
locals
do as Rome.
expect. Right. So if you are at a restaurant and the restaurant has set expectations around your conduct, being using proper manners, and that's going to really be dependent on where you are, what
Hmm.
country you're in, who's serving, like all of that. But you should be following those rules. So if that means not bringing a child with you to the restaurant, then that's what that means.
So
And
I think that there are benefits to adhering to those rules that
yeah.
most people don't think of. Obviously, we've touched on the spread of disease
Hmm.
and overall cleanliness, but it can be more than that.
Yeah,
One
I
of the
think comfort is a big one, because especially if you're going out to dinner and you're at a restaurant where maybe you're getting to know the person, like you are maybe a new coworker, or maybe a new partner, or maybe a new friend. When you go to a third party location, you are kind of you're both coming out of your own zone. You're not on each other's territory, and then at the same time, there's a shared set of expectations to allow comfort so that you can get to know them. If everyone at a location is expecting you to eat with your mouth closed, and everyone is expecting you to use utensils,
mhm.
and you go there and both of you go in expecting that, then you are in a more comfortable setting where you can then get to know the person or the people that you're
You're
with.
there are, when you're meeting someone and getting to know them, there are a lot of unknowns in that
Mhm.
meeting. So when you can go to a location where you eliminate a lot of those unknowns,
Right.
it facilitates the communication and the
Right.
establishment of a new relationship, because you don't have to worry about a bunch of things. If you're going to a fast food restaurant where there's going to be a lot of kids running around and probably very, very noisy, you don't really know the type of people. A lot of them may be
Right. I mean,
uh,
I would say there's very low expectations for
exactly,
manners at fast
exactly,
food
and
restaurants.
there's a wide array of types of people and types of actions that those people can be taking, which can interfere with the facilitation of establishment of relationship. Well, that's an unnecessarily complex sentence. And I think there's something related to that in terms of expectations.
Mhm.
Expectations in terms of making it easier and giving a known ground state for people to work off of is one thing. But I think another thing is identifying who does and doesn't belong. And this is something that we saw particularly in high society, where
Mhm.
if you were poor, even if you were able to dress the part, you wouldn't know the traditions and the
Right.
expectations of how to handle yourself at a meal. So you would
Mhm.
stick out like a sore thumb if you didn't follow
Yeah.
those traditions. So it's a
Right.
way of identifying people.
That yeah, and as a way of identifying people, because in a lot of cases, those traditions. I mean, we've seen it in a million movies where the royals have these traditions, and it takes you have to take multiple hours per day for years on end to actually learn all of the established rules and
Hmm.
traditions. And if you don't follow those, you stick out. And really what that's saying is we have the time to spend on these arguably useless things because
Like,
we
which
are so
fork do
well
you
off.
use to
Right.
eat the salad versus eating meat and having
Yeah.
3 forks for a meal and using a different
So,
one for, yeah.
I mean, asking you on that, since is there a legitimate reason why you should use different forks for different parts of your meal? Has there ever been a case where that has served some purpose other
So
than being fancy?
my guess is that it's associated specifically with being fancy and being high class, because if a salad fork, I believe, tends to be wider, because salad, you tend to have large, you have leaves, and
Hmm.
they can be very large, so you want to have a larger fork to be able to have more food on it at a time. If you're
Hmm.
eating a dessert, which is probably going to be significantly smaller but with very high densities of flavor, you want to take smaller bites out of it. The same size bite from a salad, in terms of how wide you have to open your mouth, if you take the same size bites of a dessert, you're not going to be able to savor the flavor of the dessert. So, a purpose of having a small, dainty little dessert fork compared to a
Hmm.
large salad fork, there actually is some utility to
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Uh, but the people that are able to get multiple forks for the slight added benefit of, well, I need to make sure that I overpower my
Right.
hunger and appetite to be able to
We can
fully
afford so
say
many different utensils, so we can use a different utensil for every, and the most
exactly.
specialized utensil for every single different thing that we might be eating.
Hmm.
That's pretty rare in I guess olden times. Like nowadays, utensils are pretty damn cheap, and you could stock your kitchen full of every single different fork and spoon and knife that is available. Not for that much money. And just about anyone in a developed country
Hmm.
could do so. But
Absolutely, but at the
that
same
hasn't
time,
always been the case.
if you're eating at home, I think if you're eating at home and you're swapping between 3 forks while you're going through a
It's
meal,
not very efficient.
it's not very efficient. You're gonna have to be cleaning it, and if
Mhm.
you're the one cleaning it, it's like, okay, I would rather just use a single fork
Yeah.
and contain my excitement for eating the dessert. It's like, all right, I'll just take smaller
Mhm.
bites, or as tends to be the case, I'll just make more dessert and have more of it, which is one of the reasons that we're getting fat.
Yeah.
We're getting fat because we don't use tiny forks.
Yeah. um that's
Now,
the case.
Now, there is, I think, in terms of traditions with just how you use cutlery, not just which fork are you using, that can be important from
Mhm.
the perspective of identifying people, not just of class, but
Yeah.
whether or not they're part of your tribe, let's say. And I realize this is very specific, but if you have a fairly large town or tribe or village, and you don't know exactly who is from your village because it's large enough that you don't know everyone in the village, if
Mhm.
someone new shows up, you don't recognize them, and they share a different set of eating habits, it may clue you in to them not being from around here.
Right.
And
I mean, but is there, if you go somewhere, if you let's say you are meeting a new person and
mhm,
you go somewhere that maybe you are comfortable in, and so that's why you choose it, but maybe that other person isn't.
mhm,
Is that like how much should manners be expected if they are very most manners already are very culturally specific,
mhm,
and so going into a I'm going to say actually just a different country. I'm not going to say a different country's type food. So if you go to Japan and you are eating at a traditional Japanese restaurant in Japan, there's going to be certain expectations around what's going to be there, and they're going to be very different than if you're eating at a traditional English pub in
sure.
England.
And in some cases, knowing what to order and what not to order,
Yeah,
or like what combinations, if you're ordering things that don't mesh well together, it's like, okay, you just have no idea what you're doing.
right. But
But again,
if you go somewhere where you are comfortable and the other person is not, you are kind of putting yourself. You're not on level ground for the social interaction, and that's problematic.
Sure,
Um,
you don't want to take, if you are used to high class and
mhm.
you're falling in love
One
with someone
culture is
in
high
low
class.
class, um, bringing them to a high class restaurant may make them feel uncomfortable and make it
Mhm.
less likely that the relationship will take off.
Yeah, unless you
Absolutely.
are going there with the intent of, hey, I have experience in this situation. You want experience in this situation, but you are afraid to like go get
Hmm.
it without someone there to help guide you. That's a different story. It's like
Sure.
bringing someone somewhere to be their guide or their teacher and help them, be able to navigate that space on their own in the future is one thing. But if you go there and you're like, haha, I'm going to show this person how cultured I am because they're not so cultured, so they're not gonna, know what's going on. That's not the right strategy going into a
Absolutely. And
new social
to
interaction.
to go back to some of the parts I was talking about earlier of being able to identify who does and doesn't belong there.
Mhm.
I made the point of, oh, you can tell if someone's from your village or not. That seems a little detached and like I don't care if someone's from my town. Uh, there are instances in recent history that actually has come up. So, for instance, during World War II, I believe
Mhm.
in Germany, the traditional way to eat meat was you would use a fork in your left hand, knife in your right hand. You cut the meat, you set the knife down, transfer your fork into the right hand, and use your right hand to bring the meat to your mouth.
Mhm.
And it was the transferring of utensils from one hand to another that was indicative that you were from Germany. So if there was a spy, it was very, very likely that they would not be doing that switching and they would
Right.
just bring the food up to their mouth with the fork in their left hand. And so it could tell you, hey, I shouldn't trust this person and I should
Mhm.
actually investigate this person to see if they're a spy because of the way that they eat. So those tells, while they tell you if they're from a different class, it can also tell you if they're from a different country. And particularly when you're at war with a country,
Yeah. It
it
can clue you into possible subterfuge. So,
exactly. So there is some value in being able to identify a person's class or a person's origin,
mhm.
even if not all the time. Having those traditions, if you then
Yeah.
enter a time of war, having those traditions can help you identify
Mhm.
people that you may or may not want to associate with.
Yeah. Yeah. So I will like I'm gonna I think that's a good point. One thing that um do you think it like if there are maybe not so established, but maybe some apparently rules that everyone's assuming but aren't explicitly stated. So, for example, if you go into a Japanese restaurant and you order something and they only hand you chopsticks,
Hmm.
is it all right to ask for a fork and a knife if you are uncomfortable or unfamiliar with how to use chopsticks?
I think that's a good question, because being sloppy with chopsticks can be insulting. It's the same
Mhm.
thing of if you're using a fork, you tend to hold it kind of like you would a pencil. If you grab it with a fist and you're just starting to stab your food, it's viewed as inappropriate
Mhm.
unless you have something like, if you have Alzheimer's, all I can, or not Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all I can really do is
Yep.
make a fist and grab it in some cases. So I do what I can to be able to eat.
Mhm.
But if you're capable of being less barbaric and being more developed, it's a sign of
Yeah.
respect that I will try to not end up just stabbing my food and having it get uh,
Right.
flown all over the place. But particularly with Japanese, forks have a different connotation to them. Or if you're using chopsticks and you stab the food, that has a negative connotation to it because stabbing is associated with murder.
Mhm.
Also, one of the reasons that you use chopsticks in Japan and not knives is historically, uh, all the prep work for food was done in the kitchen, and that's where
Right.
knives stayed.
Including cutting things up
Ex-
so that they were bite size.
exactly, which is also if you go to a hibachi restaurant, they don't give you large pieces of food. They'll cook the food and then chop it, then give it to you,
Mhm.
and that's
Or it'll
because
be pre-chopped before they cook it.
right. It's because in traditional Japanese culture, you don't use a knife at the
Mhm.
dinner table because a knife is a type of weapon, and using a weapon while you're eating It's not something that
Yeah.
we usually think of, but imagine the connotation that someone would have of pulling out a sword and using that to cut up their steak. It would be weird, and it's like, what the hell is wrong with you? It it's
Hmm.
probably not to that same degree, but there's the cultural and traditional connotation to using a knife or just having a stabbing motion that is viewed as barbaric. It would be like, again, holding forks in your hands with fists and just hacking away at your meal. It can have that appearance if you're stabbing food. And again, this is my
Right.
understanding of that traditional Japanese culture. I don't have personal experience in it, but
Hmm.
I'm aware of the idea.
Yeah, and you like, I mean, arguably, like, I can imagine that in the past, social situations, eating food, you aren't as ready and prepared for an attack as you might
Hmm.
otherwise be. You have your defenses down, and having people around you that maybe want your land or property
Hmm.
or just want to take your life,
Hmm.
you by not allowing them, anything that could be used weapon, simply a couple of wooden sticks, as chopsticks are,
Hmm.
you are removing that risk from yourself and others at your table potentially too.
Absolutely.
Um,
And when you're trying to do things like facilitate relationships and bring people
mhm,
together, a frequent way of having two people that disagree with each other come to an agreement, particularly from enemies, is sit down, have a meal, because you're somewhat distracted by food. And so you don't have to argue over, hey, I'm hungry. I know that you're hungry, but I need the food right now. So if you both have food, you're both somewhat sedated and you're not aggravated because of your hunger. So you're less likely to be aggressive against the other person.
mhm,
And if removing the knife from the equation, if you see your opponent that you've recently been at war with a knife in their hand, you may think that person might stab me. If you remove the knife from the equation, now you can actually just focus on talking to the person. And while that doesn't have as much of a utility in modern culture, it can still be a carryover from when that was a
yeah,
particularly pervasive problem.
yeah, definitely. So if you are in a situation, let's say you go to a Japanese restaurant, and I will say that the rule that I have always been taught, I do enjoy Japanese food, and I do know how to use chopsticks and
Hmm.
will use them when the opportunity is, when it makes sense.
Sure.
I'm not going to use them for everything. There are certain things like ice cream that chopsticks just don't work great for.
Or soup.
But or soup. Yeah, I mean like there are Japanese soups, but
Hmm.
you and for yeah, for those Japanese soups, you're not expected to use chopsticks. There are different criteria there, but
And there may
um
be like a special spoon that you can use.
right. Yeah, exactly. But what I guess the rule that I've always been taught, and I was been told when I go to a Japanese restaurant is, and something that I pass along, especially to those people, if I happen to know the expectations of that restaurant, and I happen to be with people that maybe may not or may not know how to use chopsticks. I don't mean, I don't want to assume that they do. I don't want to assume that they don't, but it's worth the question, because the rule usually is if you are offered cutlery other than chopsticks, or that you are given them, it is acceptable to use them. You should use them if you're going to be, more, I guess, more polite if by using them than trying and not doing well at using
Sure.
chopsticks.
Again with the when in Rome, do as the Romans.
Hmm. Right, but I will say there are, if you I guess, to continue on that general rule, um, if you ask for cutlery at a Japanese restaurant when it hasn't been offered to you, nor is it like
That that
directly
that
available.
can come across as a rejection of culture. Like I
Yeah.
want to bring my culture here. I want to eat
Mhm.
how I want, and I'm not gonna give way to your rules.
Right. So my question to you is, if you are in a situation, let's say that you and myself, we go out to dinner, and you know this rule, and you kind of go in knowing that expectation, and then you see me and maybe I have less experience in this situation, and I ask for cutlery. Do you think that you have a responsibility as someone that knows better, that knows what the expectations are, to then clue me in on that expectation so that I either do
I
better next time or understand why they were unhappy that I asked?
I think what I would probably do is let you know that, hey, as far as I'm aware, that is considered somewhat rude. Or if you're, not good with chopsticks, instead of saying, hey, it's rude to ask for a fork, I can say, hey, let me help you learn how to use chopsticks, so that also shows the other people that you don't know how to use chopsticks, but I'm actively trying to teach you how to do it,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
that it's not an intentional middle finger to the culture.
hmm Yeah. I think that is the right thing to do is, do it gracefully, be tactful about instructing someone about a culture that they
Hmm.
are, potentially offending or not fully understanding.
Hmm.
And, on that, in that regard, is should it be treated differently if it is someone of, let's say, a higher social or educational standing than you? So let's say you go out to dinner and you are with your professor
Hmm.
and you are eating, like you and several students or maybe other fellow like researchers or something are eating with a professor, and that professor is, maybe the eldest and also the most experienced in your field, but they have terrible table manners. They are talking while they are eating. They're just spewing food all over themselves and the people around them,
Hmm.
but they are like they're having a good, insightful, educational conversation about it. Is there a should there be a different expectation there to
I
interrupt
I think
that?
that's where two aspects of culture are going to collide: the idea
Mhm,
of respect for your elders, and the idea of what is the proper food etiquette. Because even even if they are an elder and you should respect them for that, if they're disrespecting cultural norms in other
mhm.
regards, then it can become increasingly, depending on how many norms they're disrupting, it can become increasingly acceptable to speak out against that.
Right. And I think that's generally the case.
Hmm.
More of like, do you think it's rude to correct someone if they are themselves, being rude or like doing something that it goes against expected manners, expected
So
politeness?
I think the question that you're getting at is, what is the value of the preservation of traditions around eating of food?
Um,
Because
yes,
really, if someone is breaking those norms, it means that they're going away from
yeah,
the traditions. And if that's considered rude, if you can ignore it and say, you know what, yeah, saying you can't have your elbows on the table is kind of an old fashioned thing that doesn't really apply anymore. I don't really care. I don't care which fork you use. It's
yeah,
perfectly fine to sit there and say nothing about it if the traditions don't have utility anymore. That
mhm,
being said, trying to preserve them and say we are going to do things even though they're not 100% necessary because there has been historical use for them,
it's
and
tradition.
yeah, exactly, it's tradition and they may become useful again. So as a good example with food scarcity, having an appreciation for food. Say,
Mhm,
a lot of people will say grace right before dinner, and there's a religious aspect to it, but even if it's just something as simple as I saying to yourself, I am thankful for this meal. And you say that every
mhm,
single time. When food becomes more scarce, you maintain that thankfulness versus
yeah,
someone that, let's say, they never feel thankful for having their food because it's plentiful. When food suddenly becomes scarce, they aren't thankful for the food they have. They are desperate for getting new food. And
right.
so having an appreciation for food, while not strictly necessary most of the time, can become important when problems arise. So I think that
Mhm,
that's part of the benefit around preservation of food and appreciation of food, and the traditions around both of those aspects can have drastic utility, particularly during times of food shortage, even if that's increasingly uncommon.
yeah, that's yeah. I think that there is a there most cultures, want to continue to propagate their culture and propagate their traditions. And
Hmm.
if you are partaking in being a part of that, even if their cultures and traditions don't have a practical and like a utility sense,
Hmm.
uh, they're not they're not um, they're not
The,
useful per se directly. You have a responsibility to respect their desire to continue their culture and continue their traditions.
that's a great point. It's not just about food preservation during times of food scarcity. It's also just the preservation of the culture. Not
Mhm.
only being able to identify people that don't belong in the culture, like the spies during World War II that we brought up, but just keeping your culture going. That if your culture has lasted this long, there's obviously a reason for it, and so preserving the
Mhm.
values of that culture, no matter how small, can be important for keeping that culture intact.
Yeah, definitely. And in many cases, seeing like if especially if your culture or your traditions directly go like work against maybe another culture's traditions or culture,
Hmm.
you want to preserve that, and you can be inviting of people to come in, of people of that other culture to come in
Hmm.
and partake and learn about your ways. But there is a like if they come in and they start to do their ways, and maybe you have a young child around that you're actively working on teaching your traditions to, and they see these other traditions, then it may be polluting the culture going forward, and that's you don't want that, especially if there are aspects of each culture that directly work against each other.
Absolutely. And
Culturally, like socially speaking, not so much like war, but if it is traditional in one culture to eat with a utensil, and it's traditional in another culture to eat with your hands, like if a child sees people eating with their hands when you're trying to teach them how to use a fork, they're going to be like, well, they do it, and then
hmm
hurting the culture going forward.
well, and I think there are other aspects to it. So, for instance, in uh, developing countries in particular, where toilet paper has not really been a thing,
Hmm.
there's a tradition to use only one hand to eat. That you tend to not use utensils, but use one hand to eat, and you use the other hand to wipe your ass.
Hmm. Yeah,
And
there's a utility to that.
there's definitely a utility to having a separation of which hand does what,
Right.
because the people that wipe their ass and then go and eat with that, you're much more likely to get sick, even if they
Don't
and
shit where you eat.
exactly. And so putting those things together is pretty simple. Like, hey, so the people that eat with the hand that they wipe their ass with, they tend to get sick really quickly. Maybe there's
Mhm.
something to that, and we should only eat with one of our hands and use the other hand for wiping our ass. So that's kind of a natural consequence of when you don't have uh, cle- if it's difficult to keep clean and you don't have access to toilet paper, um, or that type of sanitation, just keeping your hands separate is a way around that. Now,
Mhm.
those types of cultures, historically at least, have also had a punishment for thieves. That if you are caught stealing,
You
y-
cut off a hand.
yes, one of your hands is removed. That has two effects. Number one, it says, "Hey, we're serious about thieves. Don't steal things, or we're going to cut off your
Mhm.
hand," which makes you lose a lot of utility. It also
Yeah.
marks you as a thief, but also it means that you now have to wipe your ass and eat with the same hand, which increases
Mhm.
the likelihood that you may die of some sort of septic disease. But also, it means that you can no longer adhere to those cultural norms. So
Yeah.
it lets other people know that you have seriously jeopardized the culture by
Mhm.
breaking a cultural norm of not stealing. And that means that you are forced to now also break other cultural norms by eating and wiping with the same hand.
Yeah. Yep. So in that sense, I mean, you have utility there.
hmm and I think again, I think the point that we're coming back to a lot is that the way you eat identifies you as a person and identifies where
Mhm.
you grew up, identifies what you know. So there's a lot you can learn off of the way that someone eats, and that can
Mhm.
have drastic utility in terms of interacting with people.
Yeah, and I mean, even in regards to, um, you know, not like maybe let's say a specific habit itself does not have utility. So using your right hand to bring the food to your mouth on the fork instead of your left hand.
If
That
you assuming that you regularly wash your hands using your right hand
Yeah,
versus your
yeah,
left
yeah.
hand with a
I'm
fork.
I'm just gonna say, like, modern day, if you are eating with someone, and let's say you go to a traditional German restaurant, and while there, that person changes their behavior to meet, the customs of Germany, or maybe that restaurant in
Hmm.
particular, and they go out of their way to ensure that they cut with their right hand, scoop it onto the fork with their left hand, transfer it to their right hand, then put it to their mouth.
Hmm.
You see that, and it's like, okay, that doesn't have direct utility, but what that is telling me is that they are a person that understands and respects other cultures. And maybe that's what I am looking for in a person. I want someone that's going to show respect for anyone and anything, and I want, because that's going to help, you know guide potentially future generations, if the goal of this interaction is
Hmm.
future copulation. But that is that it it's like, hey, this person is cultured, therefore, then they understand other cultures, not just their own, and therefore they can pass that on to our children potentially, and show and help our children be more worldly and like understand things beyond just what's immediately around them and be ready to handle those things.
So what you're
So,
saying is that if you're traveling abroad and you really want to get laid, you should eat your food with your fork in the correct hand.
well, I'm not saying traveling abroad. I'm saying if you are trying to impress someone, uh,
Absolutely. No,
like
showing that you understand
show
the
an appreciation of other cultures.
show an appreciation of all other cultures, but also just show knowledge of the traditions and
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And it can also be used to communicate in terms
Mhm.
of politeness. So two things that I can think of when eating at a restaurant, at least particularly fancy restaurants are the ones that actually might know this. If you put both utensils on one side of your plate, that is a signal to the waiter that you're done with your
Mhm.
plate.
Yeah.
And
And
that makes perfect
if
sense
you
in terms of
cross
where it
them,
came
it
from. Of
means
if
yeah,
you're
yeah.
still using both hands, then the utensils are going to be resting on opposite sides of the plate. If you have both utensils on one side of the plate, it means that you're not actively planning on using them. And if you're not actively planning on using them, you're saying, "Hey, get this food out of my face." Uh, and I don't remember which direction the rule is, but I believe having your fork up versus having your fork down can express to the waiter distaste for the meal. So if you didn't particularly like it, you
Mhm.
can silently, I believe fork down means that you didn't like it, fork up means you did. I
Mm.
but it's a
I'm not
50-50
sure.
chance. I
Yeah.
don't know. So, but for the people that do know that, if you're at a fancy restaurant, you can put your fork in the direction that says I didn't like this meal,
Yeah.
and the waiter can take that back and give it as feedback to the chef.
Right.
So
And
so
there are other, signals that you can do with cutlery. I know the common ones that I see often are crossing of the cutlery on the plate means that you are going to come back to it, but you're taking a break.
yes.
And then putting it parallel to each other on the plate means that you are finished.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, most restaurants I feel don't respect, like, don't pay attention too closely. And nowadays, unless they're, high class restaurants or like
Yep.
there's expectations set because most people don't. I would say most people don't understand those etiquette in the U.S.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that is yeah. There is a utility to that, assuming everyone follows it.
Assuming
Because if
everyone
you
follows
don't
it and
understand that and you put your utensils parallel and you step away for
and
a
so
second and you come back and your food's gone, you're like, I was still eating that.
yes, so it can be problematic in terms of people not knowing it, but if most people don't know that type of etiquette, then it no longer becomes an effective way of communicating.
Yeah.
But
It needs to be
when you
something that everyone follows.
right, and specifically when you go to a fancy restaurant where they actually follow those rules, then it can be an extra form of communication such that the waiter can now interact with you and take food out of your way while you're having a conversation with someone else. If I'm actively
Mhm.
having a conversation, or you have two CEOs that are trying to make a really expensive business deal, their time is really valuable, and a waiter coming in saying, "Excuse me, are you done with your food?" That can derail your train of thought, which when you're
Right.
talking about tens of millions of dollars of deals, that can be a lot of money down the drain for
Mhm.
that interruption. So
Yeah.
having the conversation, putting both utensils on one side of the plate, and then continuing that conversation while someone magically comes in and takes the plate away from you, there is actually practical utility as you go higher and higher up in society, even if down low, or at least in cheaper society, having utensils on the side of your plate at a McDonald's, no one's going to come and pick up your food. It doesn't
Right.
matter.
Yeah. Very different expectations.
Absolutely. But that being said, and it sounds like we're very much in agreement that while we may not agree on what manners should be used, there's usually a historical precedence to why that particular tradition was
Mhm.
developed. Whether it be food preservation, appreciation for foods so that you're more likely to not abuse the food when you have it, as well as for communication, identification purposes of seeing, is this person part of my culture? Are they paying respect to my culture by trying to learn and use the practices that are specific to our locality?
Mhm.
Are they do they know it? So saying I am knowledgeable about your culture. There while many times, or a large majority of the time, it may not seem like there's practical utility to maintaining good manners with your eating habits, I think
Mhm.
that in practice, it does a lot more than we actually realize, but it tends to be mostly subconscious.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it shows, yeah, it shows respect in some cases, it shows knowledge in other cases, um it is useful in those regards. And then it has, maybe in some cases, has utility that some people don't realize.
And I think the utility besides respect and demonstration of knowledge is, well, and identification purposes,
Mhm.
is definitely just health.
Yeah,
Not
yeah.
blowing your nose while you eat is, it's pretty obvious
Or
that
at least aiming away from the food.
exactly that there are health implications beyond all the cultural, traditional respect and identification aspects of food.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. So I will add one caveat. I think I think we're in agreement. It is important to understand and try to use other people's like try to respect other people's cultures and traditions if you are in their if you're in a their
mhm.
territory, or they're the ones setting the expectations. I'll put it that way.
Yeah,
If and to an extent, I think the one exception there is if there is something that is traditional but is actually harmful to your own health. So let's say it is traditional always to eat with your hands, but that you haven't had a chance to wash your hands all day
mhm.
today and you were doing some pretty nasty things earlier with both hands. You probably you can respect their culture to an extent, but you're like, I don't really want to eat with my hands. I'm going to do
And
something else instead.
absolutely, and it may be insulting, but if you know that the utility is trying to avoid disease, you may
Mhm.
choose that over respecting the culture, which it
Right.
makes a statement. But if they understand that statement and they see that your hands are really dirty, if
Yeah.
you're working on an engine all day and your hands are black and you like, I would rather use utensils, then they may understand it.
Yeah. I
And
mean, and
and
or
other
maybe you're in a situation you can't wash your hands is the
sure.
other thing. It's like, you can go wash your hands, you could do that and then respect their culture.
Sure, absolutely. And if someone is trying to teach you, if you're again with the example that we keep bringing up of a Japanese restaurant, if someone's trying to teach you how to use chopsticks and they say, "Hey, it's respectful to use chopsticks. Let me teach you how to use chopsticks," making an effort to
Mhm.
learning how to use them is a sign that while you don't know about the culture, you're trying to respect it. And
Yeah.
generally speaking, making the attempt at respect is the is more important than being successful at
Yeah.
the action. It's attempting the action that's important.
Right. Right. Um, yeah, I think we are completely in agreement. It's
Mhm.
there is utility to many food manners, and there are like social and cultural reasons to respect other people's traditions and manners when you are in their setting, but
Absolutely.
not always. Like, if there are exceptions to that. And yeah, I mean, you brought up Parkinson's earlier. If you
Hmm.
have Parkinson's and are unable to use chopsticks, if and you go there and you didn't know that the expectation was that you can only use chopsticks, you're
Hmm.
you're kind of unable to eat.
There's a certain level of accommodation that is expected, and if or ability, and if you don't maintain that ability, that's fine. The restaurant can be accommodating of the fact that you lack the ability to meet certain traditions.
Mhm. Yeah.
So.
So
And I believe
I
we started this episode. You said that there generally isn't much utility to the food traditions. It sounds like you've kind of flip flopped on that.
I think well, I
I
think I have flip-flopped. I think I have changed my perspective a little bit, and I think I was also speaking a little too broad at the beginning. I
sure.
think there are many things, such as which hand do you bring the food
Hmm.
to your mouth with your fork.
It seems like it
That
doesn't
type of
matter.
thing, it doesn't have any direct utility, and so
It
there, like,
it it
if
can
I'm
have
eating by
direct utility.
myself,
Sorry,
yeah, yeah.
it can have direct utility, but it usually doesn't.
Yes.
Yeah,
And so that's, I guess, that type of thing was what I was kind of unfortunately broadly associating with all food manners.
sure.
And there are many utilities to other ones. So yes, I,
So
I would say that this has um, changed my default stance there.
perfect. I mean, that's the entire reason that we have these conversations is to think about things that we don't otherwise think about. I don't really think about which hand I'm
Right.
holding my fork in, but the whole reason we have these discussions is to think about those things and see if we can change our perspectives and the perspective of people listening. So,
Yep.
perfect.
Definitely.
Anything else you want to add?
No, nothing for me.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Hi everyone! Thanks so much for listening to this discussion. Your interest really means a lot to us. If you want to help support this podcast and our goal of sparking discussions and bringing people together, check out how to contribute in the description. Happy deeping!
The content of this podcast does not reflect the views and opinions held by anyone involved. We will frequently be playing the devil's advocate strictly for the purpose of exploration of ideas and not as an endorsement of any subsequent action. We condemn all acts of violence other than those of self-defense against physical harm.